Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, it is I am the one and only Ray the Flying Squirrel here, and I'm Mighty the Armadillo here, and we are back for the likes of the Maxi Toys videos. And ladies and gentlemen, welcome back for some more Let's Play of Super Mario Advance for the Game Boy Advance. So, last time, we've essentially did manage to complete not only World 3, but also with World 4, and in addition to that, we also did manage to invite Amy Rose as a special guest. So at this point in onwards is that she's now finally joined in with the Maxi Toys crew. Yeah, exactly. So today for this video is about the fact that we're going to be continuing things on and move on to, well, let's just say 2 worlds yet again, to be more specifically, World 5 as well as World 6. Now, do you guys even remember during the informs have been World 6, and during the informs have been not only on the original NES version, but also with the Super Mario All-Stars version of the game, that you do realize about the fact that we always attempted able to go for this massive shortcut in specifically World 6-3. However, in this particular version this time around though, we don't feel like trying to able to pull off some shortcuts anymore, just because like we've already established that since in Journey Forms has been last week or so, is that obviously though we are still about to be collecting things. Specifically, not only occasional mushrooms, but it's also with the forms of advance coins. Or to be more accurate though, Mighty, is that we totally made a mistake during the informs in the last few videos ago, during the informs of this particular game so far, because as it turns out, the actual proper name for those particular A coins are actually known as Ace coins. So because of that though, I totally forgot that was a thing after all, mainly because no matter what though, it's about the fact that it's been about 6 days ago since we've last played this game for sure, because as far as I'm aware is about the fact I'm pretty sure that Sonic, he managed able to actually almost completely done with Sonic's story in Journey Forms been Sonic Rush recently. So because of that though, hopefully by that time until next week though, is about the fact that not only he can able to finish up everything for Sonic's story, but also he will able to actually get into the second playthrough as Blaze the Cat, basically. So because of that though, yeah, you can probably get the idea of what I was expecting. So anyways, a few things we want to talk about is about the fact that, well, today's date of course there is the 11th of May today, in some cases in 2024 today. So naturally speaking though, it's about the fact I believe we've only got about 12 days to go now until Paper Mario The Thousand Year Door Switch Remake is definitely going to be just around the corner now. So because of that though, we are still hoping about the fact that that game receives very well in terms of not only for certain sales, but also with the forms of the actual game review scores as well. But then again though, I'm sure about the fact that we'll let either Sonic will mention more about it, or Tiana will mention more about it throughout the course of the forms of not only for Sonic Rush, but also with Princess Peach Showtime respectively. Again, I apologize for my tongue twist in the end folks, but that's just mainly because, like I said before, it's been about 6 days ago since we've last played this for sure. And that's the reason for this, is because, well, suffice to say, we actually recently come across into ourselves the actual financial results so far for that particular update for the majority of the forms of the Nintendo Switch sales. So, well, to be speaking though, is about the fact that, as far as I'm aware, that it's actually now on to, let's just say, 141.32 million units sold now. So because of that though, yeah, despite it was actually a small amount compared to the forms of how it does it on the past few years, or the past few months rather, but regardless of everything else though, it's about the fact that we are still fully appreciate that the Nintendo Switch is actually doing super duper well. Anyway. Oh boy, we actually come across to the harder variation of these Bodos, specifically the green Bodo, where she can no longer shoot eggs, but rather she shoots fireballs. So, in fact, kind of thing about it though, Mighty, is about the fact that she actually becomes a playable character in not only in Mario Kart 8 Deluxe, but also at the forms of Mario Kart Tour, as in Green Bodo. So because of that though, far as worth mentioning. So either way, thankfully we've managed able to get ourselves our extra life back after that particular unexpected death from that particular ace coin that we're about to go after. But regardless of everything else though, Ray, is about the fact that I'm pretty sure we're getting pretty close towards the end of the main portion of Super Mario Advance. Although, there's actually more to it than that though, Mighty, but then again though, we'll explain more about that if we continue proceedings for this, basically. So, Anyway, as far as we've already established that before, that recently, that the Nintendo Switch is now on to 141.32 million units sold. And in addition to that, certain games, including some new ones, has been updated for the actual specific sales. So because of that though, as far as I'm aware, is that those only 2 games have been added for the sake of the forms of the best-selling games list so far, but we'll explain more about that if we somehow continue discussing for that particular topic worth noting for. So here we go now on to World 5-2, and basically though, I think, relatively speaking though, this is going to be the 4th time going to be playing as Mario right here. And then straight to the point though, is about the fact that much like the original NES version of the game, including the Super Mario All-Stars version of the game, that will save Mario for the 5th and final time once we get to the true final level in the game, which is of course World 7-2 basically. So either way though. Anyway though, so let's discuss upon the forms of how the specific Nintendo Switch games have recently been updated in terms of sales numbers. So, for instance, first of all, Mario Kart 8 Deluxe is still on top at the moment, except now is actually currently on to 61.97 million copies sold. So, usually relatively speaking though, as a port to a Wii U game, is actually doing really fantastic still. And to make matters even better though, Mighty, thanks to the forms of the actual Booster Calls Pass DLC, that'll make sense to able to actually boost up the forms of the actual sales numbers. So because of that though, yeah, kudos to that. And second place is still goes to, let's just say, Animal Crossing New Horizons, and relatively speaking though, that game is now on to 45.36 million copies sold. And for third place goes to still Super Smash Bros. Ultimate, except this time that game is now on to 34.22 million copies sold. I'm guessing it's all thanks to the forms of the DLC as well, so that makes sense to able to actually boost the actual sales numbers when it comes to the forms of when certain games do have DLC, or specifically paid DLC as far as I'm usually concerned with that stuff. So either way, fourth place still goes to The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild because it makes sense, because obviously it's one of, without a doubt, one of the best Zelda games of all time, which I honestly still agree. And usually, relatively speaking though, usually specifically the Switch version most likely. I would say it applies to the Wii U version as well, but obviously the Wii U version sells less compared to the forms of the superior Switch version, because you know, you can play the game on the go rather than just getting stuck indoors, and on top of that, thank God you don't have to worry about the forms of this loose connection problem for the sake of the Wii U gamepad functionality as far as I'm aware. So either way, yeah, anyway, for The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild on the Switch version anyway, is actually now on to 31.85 million copies sold. So it's doing really well. And meanwhile, for 5th place is still Super Mario Odyssey, and is currently now on to 27.96 million copies sold. So yeah, because of that though, that game is doing rather well, especially considering for the fact that we still have no idea what's going to be up next for 3D Mario, but my guess is about the fact that it'll expect it able to be on the Switch successor. So because of that though, makes sense indeed, because as far as I'm aware is that in the later Switch games to come, it'll be most likely for remakes, ports, and all that stuff. So because of that though, we'll explain more about that in a second, because as far as I'm aware, as far as 6th place, as far as I'm concerned, is actually Pokemon Sword/Shield. So basically those like 2 games combined into one, basically. As far as I'm aware, they did sold for about 26.27 million copies sold, whilst meanwhile for 7th place is actually Pokemon Scarlet and Violet, and is now on to 24.92 million copies sold. So at least it's doing rather well, despite its controversy, for the sake of the forms of how bad the graphics looked when it comes to both Pokemon Sword and Shield, alongside with the forms of Scarlet and Violet, especially notable because of all its technical problems and all that stuff. But regardless of everything else though, is that both those Pokemon games, specifically when it comes to both Sword and Shield, and as well as the forms of Scarlet and Violet combined, that they're doing rather well despite its flaws. So because of that though, and as far as I'm aware, is that I believe 8th place goes to, let's just say Super Mario Party. Geez, Super Mario Party is still doing really dang well. Likely also, for the sake of time, about the fact that God knows if Nintendo decides able to release the next Mario Party at some point. But for I've heard it anyway, but let's not get ahead of ourselves. So anyway, for Super Mario Party, it was now on to 20.66 million copies sold, so it's still doing rather well. And meanwhile, we've got The Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom was actually on to 20.61 million copies sold, so it's almost catching up for the sake of 8th place, for the sake of the forms of just behind Super Mario Party in terms of the forms of the actual sales numbers, as far as I'm concerned. So at the very least, it's actually doing really well. And for 10th place, it's still New Super Mario Bros. U Deluxe, strangely enough. And apparently, though, that game has been sold for about 17.45 million copies sold. So because of that, though, still it does rather well, despite its issues here and there. Likely also for the sake of the forms of power factor with no new additions has been added, aside from the fact that with Toadette is the only new playable character in that particular version of the game, and on top of that, Nabbit can able to actually become playable in both New Super Mario Bros. U as well as New Super Luigi U, all in one particular package, whilst unlike in the Wii U version, that Nabbit was only playable in New Super Luigi U, basically. So, anyway. And as far as other games are concerned, well, Luigi's Mansion 3 has now been sold for about 14.25 million copies sold, so it's actually doing really well. And meanwhile, we've got Super Mario 3D World plus Bowser's Fury is now on to 13.47 million copies sold, so it's actually doing really well too. And also we've got Super Mario Bros. Wonder, and as a result, it's currently now on to 13.44 million copies sold. So apparently, though, Super Mario Bros. Wonder is actually also doing really well. Which is especially noticeable about the fact that that game has been out for about, I would say, 8 months from now on. So, relatively speaking, though, it still did really well. At least as far as I'm usually concerned with that, right from the start. So, anyway, the next game they've mentioned is the forms of Nintendo Switch Sports, and it did somehow reach onto 13.11 million copies sold, despite the fact I found that game to be kind of underwhelming to me, though, mainly because of the forms of power factor when it comes to post-launch, or specifically when it first launched, it feels a bit underwhelming to me. But as far as I'm aware, as far as time went on, that anyone else seemed to able to really enjoy it for quite a bit, despite the fact that it does have some issues though. And on top of that, with Mario Party Superstars, that game is now on to 12.89 million copies sold, so it's also doing really well, whilst unlike the forms of how it does it in, you know what I'm saying, with Mario Party Advance, as well as the forms of Mario Party Star Rush and the Top 100, that 3 of those games in particular didn't do so well when it comes to the forms of the actual sales numbers, because as far as I'm aware, that's basically though when it comes to Mario Party Advance, that's basically though is almost an entirely different game, all things considered, with the lack of multiplayer functionality, whilst compared to the forms of how it does it on well, let's just say in Star Rush, alongside with the Top 100, that usually both of those games do have the forms of grid-based board, and as far as I'm usually concerned with that too, that basically there is no minigame instruction screen, unlike the forms of how it does it on any other Mario Party games in the past. And on top of all that stuff though is about the fact that both of those games did came out on the 3DS, not on the Wii U, or even the Nintendo Switch in some cases though. Whilst thankfully though, we somehow managed able to get some really dang good Nintendo Switch Mario Party games for sure. Yeah, like we've got one in 2018 and we've got the other one in 2021, including some honorable mentions for the likes of the forms of the Nintendo Switch Online Expansion Pack. Like in 2022, we did somehow receive not only Mario Party 1, but also with Mario Party 2 in the exact same time, during the forms of in November in 2022. And then meanwhile, we've actually got Mario Party 3 since in last year, specifically last year's October, so relatively speaking though is about the fact that we are still very glad that the entire trilogy of N64 Mario Party games have now been finally get re-releases, so because of that though, that'll be a good alternative if you if you guys have not tried out the forms of those specific games before. So because of that though, because you know what I'm saying about the fact that every nowadays with Mario Party 3, genuine cartridge version is gonna get extremely expensive right now. Yeah, this also means it includes with the forms of complete in box, with manual and all that stuff, which you probably already know what's to come. So anyway, let's get back into the forms of this particular game's sales units as far as I'm aware. Sorry for a little bit of a awkwardness is actually going on. Plus it's mainly because, well, as far as I'm aware, that I somehow belched. So because of that though, I apologize for this point folks, because I know it's incredibly gross, but either way. Alright, time to do this ultimate shortcut right there, by simply have to jump at the right time and crouch at the same throughout for this particular point right there, so just in case I can able to skip some good chunks of the level. Oh, I see, because as far as I'm aware, that thankfully though, that Luigi can jump high, and he can also slip around occasionally. So, it's a good thing we did somehow select Luigi, or should I say, you selected Luigi, because as far as I'm aware, that he's actually pretty useful in this stage, because you can able to actually go through quite a lot of climbing involved. So, either way though, that's as far as I can try and able to explain about there. So, anyway. Back into what you're saying about the forms of that specific, sales numbers for certain Nintendo Switch games. Oh yeah. For Splatoon 3 is actually now on to 11.96 million copies sold, and that really helps, especially noticeable because I think something tells me thanks to the forms of, once again, DLC, so overall it did manage to help out for able to support Splatoon series at all costs. So either way though, if God knows if Nintendo decides to work on the next installment or something, well, despite the fact that we've already did somehow received the forms of that particular second DLC already back in during the forms of some time in February or something. So yeah, I digress. And also we have Kirby and the Forgotten Land, and so far that game is now on to 7.52 million copies sold. So once again, it's actually doing really well, especially considering for the fact it was actually relatively new back in Journey Forms of in 2022 for sure. And as far as I can gather, that maybe at some point that Kirby is going to be on to the Switch successor or something, but then again, no, it's a bit tricky to tell at this point. So either way, oh, I know what you're trying to do. You're trying to use the power block right at Bodo, even though it does manage to able to hurt her, but it doesn't go completely all the way. Yeah, I was really hoping I can able to finish her off for good, but oh well, no big deal. Oh jeez, that fireball just come out of nowhere. Oh wait, it comes from that particular Bodo's mouth, so that makes sense because she was all in red and everything. But at least you did manage to finish her off, so... Alright, let's grab this orb so I can able to move on to the next boss. I believe the next boss is going to be pretty tricky for sure, because not only you became Luigi, but it's also about the fact that the actual attacks can be pretty unpredictable at times. And also something tells me that particular sprite of that particular crab looks a bit familiar, doesn't it? Oh yeah, it actually comes from Mario Bros. Classic from the Game Boy Advance, so... Oh jeez, is he gonna involved?
You'll make a tasty treat.
Oh jeez, so apparently though, that side creeper decided able to actually become evolved into Claw Grip. So yeah, that's a pretty interesting transition, or specifically that interesting transformation for sure. So as I said before, this boss is pretty tricky, mainly because of the forms of this unpredictable pattern for that particular, you know, rocks attacks and everything. And as far as I'm aware, later on in certain bosses, they now have more health. So because of that though, whilst unlike the forms of how it does it in Mouser, specifically the first encounter with Mouser, as well as Triclide, as well as the forms of, I would say, Fry Guy, basically. Well, there's only one particular boss exception to this, strangely enough, and that's what appears to be Robo-Bodo, where basically Robo-Bodo, she actually did manage to have 5 health, whilst compared to Claw Grip is also having 5 health, and then as soon as we move on to World 6, that basically though is about the fact that we'll explain more about that if we somehow proceed on to World 6, basically. So either way though, I think so far that we somehow spent on this particular world of World 5 for about 20 minutes so far. Plus, it's mainly because of the forms of those ace coins that we need able to actually get, you know? Although I will admit it though right away though, Ray, is that have you seen a commercial for Super Mario Advance, specifically the American version? Oh yeah, what about it? It may look a bit weird at first glance because it's somehow managed able to use real people for the sake of trying to emulate or trying to able to become reality when you actually playing the Game Boy Advance or something. And basically though, as soon as you're able to see the actual transition with that particular see-through glass or something like that, and basically though, all these people are acting out like weird animations. So because of that though, yeah, I thought it was a little bit weird too, kind of thinking about it while looking back on it though, especially concerning for the fact that, like I said before, that this particular game first came out in 2001. So because of that though, I honestly found it was a bit surprising about the fact that this game did came out before Super Mario Sunshine, believe it or not, because relatively speaking though, that Super Mario Sunshine did came out in 2002, so relatively speaking though, it's just about the fact that I felt it was a little bit strange, so... And it's also worth noting for is about the fact that I'm pretty sure in the Japanese version of Super Mario Advance 2, Super Mario World, I believe that particular game did originally came out in 2001 as well. So because of that though, yeah, that seems kind of an interesting release date as far as I'm usually concerned, whilst compared to the English version of Super Mario Advance 2, Super Mario World, that it did somehow came out in 2002, whilst unlike the Japanese version, did came out in 2001 basically. At least, whenever I did manage to research on it, that is. So, anyway, let's move on now to the next game that has been recently got updated for the actual Switch sales, and that's what appears to be Pikmin 4. And so far, Pikmin 4 is now on to 3.48 million copies sold. So because of that though, it's actually doing really, really well as well. And meanwhile, we've got Super Mario RPG, that's, you know, for a remake of a good old classic RPG game for the Super Nintendo. And usually it's got remade onto the Nintendo Switch. And relatively speaking though, that Super Mario RPG remake is now on to 3.31 million copies sold. So it's also doing really, really well. And on the subject for this point, there's actually 2 new games have been added for the actual Switch sales update. And those 2 in questioning is the most recent ones, which we have not only Princess Peach Showtime, but also with Mario vs. Donkey Kong Remake. So, for instance, Princess Peach Showtime is actually currently on to 1.22 million copies sold. And finally, for Mario vs. Donkey Kong Remake is actually now on to 1.12 million copies sold. So because of that though, yeah, it's actually quite impressive actually, concerning for the fact that this is only just the beginning of the forms of 2024 for the majority of the Nintendo Switch's lifespan. And during the forms of that current year we actually onto at the moment, whilst unfortunately though, still no luck of the forms of WarioWare Move It, and I'm afraid to tell you is that WarioWare Move It might actually sell even lower compared to the forms of how it does it in not only for the majority of certain Switch games that came out in 2023, but also about the fact that with the in comparison with WarioWare Get It Together, because as far as I'm aware, that WarioWare Move It did somehow manage able to become the worst selling games of the entire series so far, at least as far as I'm aware of. I think the reason being for this point, Mighty, is most notably because what I've heard that it does have a lack of replayability, unlike the forms of how it does it on Get It Together, that it does have multitude of replayability for that game anyway, whilst compared to the forms of how it does it on WarioWare Move It though, it does have lesser amount of content that's basically, they do have an achievement system, to be more specifically with both WarioWare Gold as well as WarioWare Get It Together, in addition to the forms of, well, gem-packed for modes you can able to try out, like for instance with a bunch of side modes in during the forms of in WarioWare Gold, whilst usually in the forms of in WarioWare Get It Together, they can also manage able to interact with a multitude of stuff here and there. Although, for WarioWare Move It though, it does not contain not only achievements or missions, but it's also about the fact that, well, I'm sure that some toy sales were able to mention about that game even more once we get to that particular game at some point. So, for the sake of Let's Plays anyway, so... Anyway, so that pretty much does it for World 6-1. And now we're about to be moving on to the World 6-2. So because of that though, it's your turn, Mighty. So what character are you going to be picking? I will classify for saying Luigi, or actually on second thought, I'm also able to go for Peach, so because of that though, and suffice to say for this point, Mighty, this will be the final time we're going to be playing as Peach from now on, because as far as I'm aware, this is our 5th time experiencing Peach's gameplay style, and that could be also applies to probably Luigi as well, so because of that though, and same applies with Toad and Mario, because like you said this before, we'll save Mario for last, because as far as I'm aware, that Mario is the main character, of course, like any other games up to that point. So, yeah, and as far as I'm aware, that's all I can really say about the Form's particular recent update for the actual games sales numbers, as well as the Nintendo Switch sales numbers. So, yeah, it's doing rather well, especially considering for the fact that we've now on to the final year for the Nintendo Switch before Nintendo is going to be working on a Switch successor. So because of that though, yeah, you get the idea of how that's going to be turns out to be. So anyway, speaking of Switch 2 actually, or specifically the Switch successor, is that Nintendo says Switch 2 will be officially announced before the end of 2025 in March. So because of that though, thank goodness that Nintendo has finally mentioned about the phone's that Switch successor that everyone else around the internet keeps on and on about it. So thankfully though, they somehow finally mentioned about that. And relatively speaking of, what I've heard anyway, is that it looks like, get this, we're about to be finally going to be getting a Nintendo Direct at some point in next month, in June. So, even then though, here's the catch though, is that it's obviously not going to be, it's not going to mention about the forms of a Switch successor anytime soon, but to be more accurate though, right, I think it's most likely because they'll try to mention about the forms of the final batch of Nintendo Switch games coming out for the likes of the latter half of the forms of 2024, because as far as I'm aware, that the first half has already been sorted for the sake of the forms of some Switch games for sure. So all needs left now is just the final half, or specifically the second half of the forms of certain games coming out for Switch 1 before they moved on to the Switch successor and during at some point later down the road. So because of that though, but here's the thing I'm a little bit worried about, and that's what it appears to be about the fact I'm hoping it's going to be most likely focusing on first-party games, not so much for partner showcase or something like that. Seriously, I just cannot stress enough about the fact that I'm not a big fan of the partner showcase direct styles, because as far as I'm aware, that I'm really hoping that'll be the end of the Forza Partner Showcase direct system, because I just cannot stress enough, I'm not a big fan of those kind of stuff. Although, don't get me wrong, that 2022 is the only good one in my opinion, because it actually features not only Mario, but also with Sonic and Pac-Man essentially. But aside from all that stuff though, when it comes to every single partner showcases while looking back on them though, likely also we've got 4 of them in 2020, pretty obvious, and on top of that, certain game selections are, for the most part, is alright. Like, the highlight is, of course, Hyrule Warriors Age of Calamity, of course, and on top of that, with Kingdom Hearts Melody of Memory. But aside from that, the game selections are bleak, for the most part, when it comes to 2020's Partner Showcase Directs. And meanwhile, we've got the recent one, Journey Forms of around 3 months ago, actually, and that one is pretty much mediocre to me. I mean, the only enjoyable one I can probably think about is Super Monkey Ball Banana Rumble, but that's about it to me though, because as far as I'm aware, some games are pretty hit and miss to me though, while some of them are actually okay enough, but it's just that it's not my interest. So because of that though, it is even bad enough about the fact that you know how recently that Endless Ocean Luminous has received some very mixed reception, so because of that though, yeah, it really didn't help that much. So anyway, so I'm basically done with this particular World 6-2. And now it's my turn to play as Luigi during the forms within World 6-3. And as we said this before already, I don't think it's possible we can able to pull off that particular shortcut anymore, because obviously though we are still focusing on collecting those ace coins. So because of that though, I'm up for it. So, and also I completely forgot to mention about, ever since in Journey forms of this whole entire prologue, or specifically the beginning portion of this Let's Play in general, is that when you get to the character selection screen, it actually shows you the Fonz's status this time around. So either way though, that's something I completely forgot to mention about, since in Journey forms within the beginning portion of this whole entire Let's Play so far. So either way though, now speaking of which though, is about the fact that yes indeed, that one of those specific messages that popped up for the likes of Nintendo Co. Limited. Basically though, they did somehow mention say this, like this is for Rekura, I think is what it says anyway, president of Nintendo. He did say about the fact that he stated this. We will make an announcement of about the successor to Nintendo Switch within this financial year, and it will have been over 9 years since we announced the existence of the Nintendo Switch back in March in 2015. Oh jeez, is that crazy to believe? About the fact that with the Nintendo Switch has been first announced back in Journey Forms of almost 10 years ago, since in March 2015, just around that time where Mario Party 10 rolled around on the Wii U. Jeez, it's crazy, doesn't it? Yeah, tell me about it. So anyway, back on topic. We will be holding a Nintendo Direct this June regarding the Nintendo Switch software lineup for the latter half of 2024. So this means that we will be receiving some final batch of games for the Nintendo Switch 1 for the sake of the forms of the later on for 2024, which I was assuming about the fact that they're just trying to get the last few releases out of the way before they moved on to the next system, I'm sure. So yeah, it's going to be pretty exciting for sure, but then again though, I'm really hoping about the fact that they'll bring in the general Nintendo Directs, not the partner showcase, because I'm just basically simply done with those partner showcases now. So I'm biased I guess, but still. But either way, let's continue. But please be aware that there won't be any mention of the Nintendo Switch successor during that presentation. So yeah, it feels remarkably similar to the forms of how it does it on, let's just say, back in 2016, specifically, the Nintendo 3DS Direct back in Journey forms of by the end, or should I say on the 1st of September anyway, in 2016, where they somehow announced the forms of the final, well actually kind of thinking about it, the next batch of Nintendo 3DS games, specifically with all these headlines, announcements, and all that stuff, like ranging from, you know what I'm saying, with Mario Party Star Rush, and on top of that, some even more smaller titles for likely also Mario Sports Superstars, and especially noticeable with Hey Pikmin, although back in the day it just simply calls it Pikmin with a Tetherfleet title, and on top of all that stuff though, with Poochie and Yoshi's Woolly World, and same applies with Super Mario Maker for the 3DS, which basically though is about the fact that I just really still wish if Yoshi's Woolly World will be ported over to the Switch. I mean, as far as I'm aware, is that since we're going to be able to receiving the Nintendo Direct coming up, and it seems kind of strange about the fact that once again it's going to take place in some point in June, just like the forms of how it does it on any other the majority of the years back in Journey forms of in 2017 when it comes to Nintendo Switch's life cycle, with only one in particular exception, that's of course 2020, just because you know what. So as far as I'm aware is about the fact that this might actually be, if I recall correctly, we did technically have one in 2017, but usually calls it Nintendo Spotlight. Yeah, I was going to be thinking about that, because it wasn't until 2018 where we did somehow receive the E3 Nintendo Direct back in 2018, where we did manage to get some games with one particular Switch game focus, and that's what appears to be Super Smash Bros. Ultimate. And relatively speaking, that was about the fact that we did also receive, you know, Super Mario Party. And oh yeah, something's worth noting for as well is that until tomorrow anyway, is that basically, well, it already did happen in Journey forms of in Japan already, but as far as I'm aware, that The Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom is not only going to be 1 year old, but it's was also about the fact that they did somehow receive the actual soundtrack CD just recently, in Japan anyway. So because of that though, yeah, it's pretty cool and pretty awesome at the same time, but it's kind of a shame about the fact that we never get a chance to be able to receive that particular soundtrack CD for The Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom just yet, because as far as I'm aware, maybe they'll try to release it in English version later down the road or something. Well, then again, it's a bit tricky to tell. So anyway, and also as far as I'm aware, is that you guys know back in Journey Films of World 4-3 that was technically the final time we're going to be seeing Pink Bodo in Journey Films of this whole entire version of the game. Yeah, and that could be also applies for the majority of Super Mario Bros. 2 USA in mind. So anyway, so let's go through here, and it looks like we come across into this familiar arena for those who have ever experienced World 1 before, except this time there's going to be filled to the brim with sparks. And oh look, we actually come across to Mouser in World 6, rather than just be on the World 3 boss, unlike the forms of how it does it on not only the NES version, but also with the Super Nintendo version being the Super Mario All-Stars version. So, yeah, basically though, we can no longer fight against with Tri-Clyde anymore for the second time, so, oh, you were so close though, Ray. Yeah, if only because those sparks are still pretty annoying to deal with. Although, what I've heard anyway, that those bombs can technically kill them. So because of that though, we can do that just about as soon as we're able to approach onto Mouser. Because as far as I'm aware, that unlike in Doki Doki Panic, you can able to actually fight against with Mouser for the 3rd time, or 3 times in a row. Because as far as I'm aware, that Claw Grip will never exist in Doki Doki Panic, because you can able to actually fight against with, let's just say Mouser 3 times, and 1 time for the sake of the Forms of Fry guy, and 1 time from Wart, and as far as I'm aware, you fight against with Tri-Clyde twice. So, whilst unlike in Super Mario Bros. 2 USA on the NES, that basically though you fight against with Mouser, I would say Mouser twice, and Tri-Clyde also twice, and meanwhile for Fry Guy you fight him once, and Claw Grip you fight him once, and Wart once. At least to be more specifically in both the NES version and the Super Mario All-Stars version. So, there we go, World 6 is done. So, hooray! Only 1 more world to go, and that's of course World 7. So with that being said folks, I suppose we should probably end things off this point right here, after we're done with the slot machine first. So let's see what, oh, we can get a 1-up back. Oh, nice. Nicely done. So anyway, join us next time for more Let's Play of Super Mario Advance. Is that we're about to be approaching onto the final world in Super Mario Advance, and that is World 7. So we'll see you guys until tomorrow. Yup, later fellas.